My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I spent 8 years living inside a world most people only see in movies, and I'm here to tell you that everything you think you know about the mafia is wrong. It's not about guns and explosions. It's about breakfast tables where nobody speaks. It's about men who smile at funerals. It's about the kind of fear that doesn't make you run, it makes you freeze, perfectly still, hoping you're not next. I met Vincent when I was 23. He wasn't a boss, he wasn't even a soldier, not officially. But he was connected, deeply connected, to a family that controlled everything from the docks to the waste management to the construction permits in 3 counties. Vincent was a facilitator. He made introductions. He smoothed over problems. He knew when to talk and, more importantly, when to stay silent. That second skill, the silence, that's what kept people alive in the mafia. The mafia had rules, but they were never written down. You learned them by watching. You learned them by seeing what happened to the people who didn't follow them. The first rule, the one that mattered most, was simple: never make the family look weak. Not to outsiders, not to rivals, not even to each other. Weakness was contagious. The mafia couldn't afford it. I remember the first time Vincent explained this to me. We were sitting in his car outside a diner in Queens. It was raining, one of those heavy summer rains that turns the streets into mirrors. He had just come from a meeting, and I could tell something had gone wrong because he wasn't eating. Vincent always ate when things went well. You know why the mafia still exists? He asked me, staring through the windshield. It's not because we're violent. Every street gang is violent. It's because we're disciplined. We're a system. You break the system breaks you. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. I didn't understand yet that he was giving me a warning. Vincent's world was structured like a machine. Every piece had a function. The bosses made decisions. The captains enforced them. The soldiers carried them out. And then there were people like Vincent, the in-betweens, the ones who kept the machine oiled and quiet. He never carried a gun. He never raised his voice. But when Vincent walked into a room, men who had killed people stood a little straighter. The mafia controlled everything through reputation. They didn't need to hurt everyone. They just needed people to believe they would. That belief was more powerful than any weapon. I saw it work 100 times. A restaurant owner behind on payments would get a visit. Not a threat, just a conversation. A reminder that cooperation was easier than resistance. And the owner would pay, not because he was forced, but because he understood the cost of refusal wasn't worth calculating. Vincent was good at those conversations. He had a way of making people feel like they were making their own choices, even when they weren't. That's a skill the mafia values more than muscle. Muscle is cheap. Persuasion is rare. Women in the mafia world existed in a strange space. We weren't members. We couldn't be. But we weren't outsiders either. We were witnesses. We sat at tables where money was counted. We overheard phone calls that ended with someone's fate decided. We cleaned houses where meetings happened. We cooked meals for men who would disappear the next day. And we were expected to see nothing, hear nothing, remember nothing. I learned quickly that the safest thing a woman could do in the mafia world was to be invisible. Not literally invisible, but functionally invisible. You could be there, physically present, but you had to act like you weren't absorbing anything. You smiled, you poured coffee, you left the room when the conversation shifted to business. And you never, ever asked questions. Some women broke that rule. I met a few. One was the girlfriend of a soldier named Tommy. She got curious. She started asking him about his work, about who he reported to, about why certain people stopped coming around. Tommy told her to stop. She didn't. 3 months later, she was gone. Not dead, as far as I know, but gone. Sent away. Erased from Tommy's life like she'd never existed. The mafia didn't kill women often, but they removed them. And removal, in its own way, was a kind of death. I never asked Vincent questions. I listened, but I never asked. And maybe that's why I lasted as long as I did. The man who made the mistake was named Anthony. Everyone called him Ant. He was 42, married, 3 kids, and he'd been with the family since he was 16. Ant was a earner. He ran a crew that handled sports betting and loan sharking, and he was good at it. He brought in steady money. He never caused problems. In the mafia, that kind of consistency made you valuable. It made you trusted. Ant wasn't flashy. He didn't wear expensive suits or drive cars that attracted attention. He lived in a modest house in Staten Island. He coached his son's little league team. He went to church on Sundays. To anyone looking from the outside, Ant was just another middle-aged guy trying to provide for his family. But inside the mafia, Ant was a fixture. He was reliable, and in a world built on paranoia and betrayal, reliability was the closest thing to safety. Vincent liked Ant. They'd known each other for years. Sometimes Ant would come over for dinner, and the two of them would sit on the back porch drinking wine and talking about nothing important. Ant had a kind face. He smiled easily. He remembered birthdays. He was the kind of person you didn't expect to fail. But the mafia doesn't care about expectations. It cares about results. And when results slip, the mafia notices. The first mistake was small. So small that most people wouldn't have even called it a mistake. Ant had a collector named Mikey, a young guy, mid-20s, eager to prove himself. Mikey was supposed to pick up a payment from a debtor who ran a body shop in Brooklyn. The debtor owed $12,000. And it was 3 weeks overdue. That kind of delay was a problem. It sent a message that debts were negotiable. In the mafia, debts are never negotiable. Mikey went to the body shop and came back with $8,000. He told Ant the debtor didn't have the full amount yet, but he'd have it in 2 weeks. Mikey said the guy seemed good for it. He said the guy was scared, apologetic, cooperative. So Ant made a decision. He accepted the $8,000 and gave the debtor an extension. On the surface, that seems reasonable, but in the mafia, reasonableness is a luxury you only get if you're in charge. Ant wasn't in charge. He reported to a captain named Sal. And Sal didn't care about reasonable. Sal cared about discipline. When Sal found out Ant had given an extension without asking permission, he called Ant in for a meeting. Vincent told me about it later. He wasn't at the meeting, but he heard about it from 3 different people, which meant it was serious. In the mafia, when a story spreads, it's because someone wants it to spread. It's a warning. Sal didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just asked Ant one question: who gave you permission to change the terms? Ant tried to explain. He said the debtor was good for it. He said 2 weeks wasn't a big deal. He said he was trying to keep things smooth, avoid unnecessary problems. But Sal stopped him. I didn't ask for your reasons, Sal said. I asked who gave you permission. Ant went quiet, because the answer was no one. That was the mistake. Not the extension itself, but the decision to make it without approval. In the mafia, autonomy is earned, not assumed. Ant had been around long enough to know that. But somewhere along the way, comfort had made him careless. He'd forgotten that trust in the mafia is conditional. It's a loan, not a gift. And loans get called in. Sal let Ant leave that day. No punishment, no threat, just a reminder to follow protocol. Ant probably thought he'd gotten away with it. He probably went home, kissed his wife, played with his kids, and figured he'd learned his lesson. But the mafia doesn't forget mistakes. It files them away, and it waits. 2 months later, the debtor with the body shop disappeared. Not killed, not arrested. He just closed up his shop one day and left town. Word was, he owed money to multiple people, not just the mafia, and he decided running was safer than staying. He was probably right, but his running created a problem for Ant. Because now the $12,000 was gone. And in the mafia, when money disappears, someone has to answer for it. Sal called Ant in again. This time, Vincent was there. He told me about it in pieces, over several nights, like he was trying to make sense of it himself. Sal didn't raise his voice this time either. He just laid out the facts. The debtor was gone. The money was gone. Ant had given the extension. Ant had vouched for the debtor. Therefore, Ant was responsible. Ant argued. He said the debtor had seemed solid. He said there was no way to predict someone would run. He said holding him responsible for someone else's actions wasn't fair. But fairness doesn't exist in the mafia. Accountability does. And accountability always flows upward until it finds someone to stick to. This time, it stuck to Ant. Sal gave Ant 2 weeks to come up with the $12,000. Not as punishment, Sal said. As restitution. The family had lost money. Someone had to replace it. Ant left that meeting pale. Vincent said he looked like he'd aged 5 years in 30 minutes. $12,000 doesn't sound like much. But for a guy like Ant, who lived modestly and funneled most of his earnings up the chain, it was everything. He didn't have that kind of cash sitting around. And borrowing it from the mafia was out of the question. You don't borrow from the people you owe. That's another rule. Ant tried to hustle. He leaned on his own debtors, pushed collections harder, called in favors. But the mafia had already squeezed most of the available money out of those sources. There wasn't much left to extract. Vincent saw Ant a few times during those 2 weeks. He said Ant looked frantic. Desperate. He was making phone calls at all hours. He was skipping meals. His hands shook when he lit cigarettes. Desperation makes people stupid, and the mafia knows that. Maybe that's why they give deadlines. Not to create urgency, but to create panic. Panicked people make mistakes, and mistakes justify consequences. Ant's second mistake was worse than the first. He tried to skim. He had a card game that ran out of a basement in Bensonhurst, and he shorted the weekly envelope he sent up to Sal. Not by much, just $1,500. He probably thought it wouldn't be noticed. Or maybe he thought he'd replace it before anyone counted. But the mafia counts everything. Always. Sal didn't confront Ant immediately. He waited. He let Ant deliver the short envelope. He let Ant think he'd gotten away with it. And then, 3 days later, Sal called a meeting. Not just with Ant, with everyone. Captains, soldiers, associates. Maybe 30 guys in a social club in Brooklyn. Vincent was there. He said the room was silent when they walked in, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Sal stood at the front of the room and held up the envelope. Someone here thinks I'm stupid, he said. Someone here thinks I don't count. He opened the envelope and laid the money on the table, bill by bill. And then he pointed at Ant. You're short, Sal said. Explain. Ant tried. He stammered something about a mistake, a miscount, an accident. But Sal cut him off. You're short, Sal repeated. And you're lying. Which one of those is worse? Ant went silent, because there was no good answer. The mafia doesn't tolerate theft. Not from outsiders. Definitely not from insiders. Stealing from the family isn't just a crime. It's a betrayal. And betrayal, in the mafia, is unforgivable. Sal didn't need to say that out loud. Everyone in the room already knew it. Sal didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He just told Ant to leave. Go home, Sal said. We'll talk later. Ant left. Vincent said he looked like a dead man walking. For the next week, nothing happened. Ant went about his business. He collected debts. He ran his card game. He showed up where he was supposed to show up. But everything had changed. People stopped talking to him. When he walked into a room, conversations ended. When he made phone calls, they went to voicemail. The mafia had made a decision. And even though no one said it out loud, everyone understood. Ant was out. He just didn't know it yet. Vincent told me he saw Ant one last time. They crossed paths outside a deli in Queens. Ant tried to act normal. He smiled. He asked about me. He talked about the weather. But Vincent said Ant's eyes were wrong. They were the eyes of someone who knows something terrible is coming but doesn't know when. You all right? Vincent asked. Ant nodded. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. And Vincent knew it. And Ant knew that Vincent knew it. They stood there for a moment. 2 men who'd known each other for years. And there was nothing left to say. Vincent told me later that he wanted to warn Ant. Tell him to leave town. Disappear. Start over somewhere the mafia couldn't reach. But he didn't. Because warning someone the mafia had decided to remove was the same as betraying the mafia yourself. And Vincent wasn't going to make that choice. They found Ant's car 3 days later. It was parked near a construction site in Jersey, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. No blood, no signs of struggle, just an empty car. Ant was gone. His wife filed a missing person report. The police investigated. They questioned people, including Vincent. Everyone said the same thing. Ant was a good guy. They had no idea what happened. They hoped he was okay. The investigation went nowhere. It always does. The mafia didn't take credit. They never do. Ant just stopped existing. His crew was reassigned. His debts were absorbed. His name stopped coming up in conversations. Within a month, it was like he'd never been part of the family at all. That's how the mafia handles problems. Not with violence, necessarily, but with erasure. You don't get a grave. You don't get a funeral. You just stop being real. Vincent was different after that. Quieter. He stopped smiling as much. He stopped eating as much. I asked him once if he was okay. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "Ant made 2 mistakes. The first one was forgivable. The second one wasn't. But the real mistake was thinking the first one was forgotten." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. But I do now. The mafia forgives nothing. It just decides when to collect. 6 months after Ant disappeared, Vincent started pulling away from the family. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention. But slowly, carefully, he reduced his involvement. He stopped taking meetings. He stopped making introductions. He told Sal he wanted to step back, focus on legitimate business, spend more time with family. Sal didn't argue. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't care. Or maybe he was just giving Vincent enough rope to see what he'd do with it. Vincent and I left New York 2 years later. We moved to a small town in North Carolina where nobody knew us and nobody asked questions. He got a job managing a hardware store. I worked at a library. We lived quietly. We didn't talk about the mafia. We didn't talk about Ant. We didn't talk about the 8 years we'd spent in a world where trust was currency and mistakes were fatal. But I think about it. I think about Ant's face the last time Vincent saw him, trying to pretend everything was fine when everything was already over. I think about the way the mafia dismantled his life without a single shout, a single threat, a single moment of visible violence. I think about how efficient it was. How cold, how final. People ask me sometimes if I miss New York. I tell them no. They ask if I miss the excitement, the energy, the life. I tell them I don't. Because what they're really asking is if I miss the mafia. And the answer is no. I don't miss the fear. I don't miss the silence. I don't miss wondering if the man I loved would come home one day or if he'd just disappear like Ant did, erased from existence because he made the wrong choice at the wrong time. The mafia is still out there. It's smaller now, quieter, harder to see. But it's there, and it still operates the same way it always has. Through fear, through reputation, through the understanding that mistakes aren't punished loudly. They're punished quietly, completely, irreversibly. Ant's wife still lives in Staten Island. I looked her up once, online, just to see. She remarried. Her kids are grown. She seems happy, or at least as happy as someone can be when part of their history is a hole that was never filled, a question that was never answered. I wonder if she thinks about Ant. I wonder if she knows what really happened. I wonder if it would be worse or better if she did. Vincent died 4 years ago. Heart attack. Natural causes. We'd been out of the life for so long that I almost believed we were safe. But the night before he died, he said something to me. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down, and he said, "I'm glad we left." I asked him if he ever regretted it. He shook his head. "The only thing I regret," he said, "is not leaving sooner." I think about that now. About the cost of staying too long in a world that doesn't forgive. About the way the mafia measures loyalty not in years but in obedience. About how Ant spent 26 years being reliable, and it didn't matter. Because in the end, the mafia doesn't care how long you've been good. It only cares that you failed once. I'm older now. I live alone in the same small town. I work in the same library. I see the same faces every day. And sometimes, when I'm shelving books or helping someone find a title, I think about the women I used to know in New York. The ones who sat at those tables and saw everything and said nothing. I wonder how many of them are still there. I wonder how many of them got out. I wonder how many of them are still pretending they don't know what they know. Because that's the thing about the mafia. It doesn't just control the people who are in it. It controls the people around it. The wives, the girlfriends, the daughters, the ones who are told to look away, to stay quiet, to be invisible. And the mafia knows that silence is more valuable than loyalty. Because loyalty can break, but silence, real silence, the kind that comes from fear, that lasts forever. I broke my silence now. I'm telling you this story. And part of me wonders if that's a mistake. If somehow, even now, even after all these years, the mafia will find out. If someone who remembers Vincent will hear this and connect the pieces. If I'll become another story, another lesson, another name that stops being mentioned. But I don't think so. Because the mafia doesn't care about old women in small southern towns who tell stories about the past. The mafia cares about threats. And I'm not a threat. I'm just a witness. And witnesses, in the end, are all that's left when the mafia is done erasing everyone else. Ant made a mistake, a small one, and then a bigger one. And the mafia didn't forgive him. It removed him, quietly, completely, and the world kept turning like he'd never existed at all. That's the truth about the mafia. It's not about power, it's about control. The control to make someone disappear. The control to make everyone who knew them pretend they never existed. The control to turn a man's entire life into a blank space that no one dares to fill. I watched it happen, and I'm telling you now so that Ant's story doesn't disappear completely. So that somewhere, someone knows that he was real, that he existed, that he made mistakes, yes, but that he was a person. A father, a husband, a man who smiled easily and remembered birthdays and tried his best in a world that demanded perfection. The mafia didn't forgive his mistakes. But maybe we can, not because he deserved it, but because remembering someone, even someone who failed, is the last act of resistance we have against a system built on erasure. That's all I have to say. That's the story. That's the truth. The mafia taught me a lot of things. But the most important thing it taught me was this: silence protects the powerful. And speaking, even years later, even when it's dangerous, even when no one's listening, is the only way to take that power back. I don't know if anyone will hear this. I don't know if it matters. But I'm saying it anyway. For Ant, for Vincent, for all the people who disappeared into the machinery of the mafia and never came out. The mafia is still out there. And it's still erasing people. Quietly, efficiently, completely. But now you know. And knowing, even if you can't do anything about it, is something. It has to be. Because the alternative is silence. And I've been silent long enough.